Good afternoon. My name is Travis Williams. I am an English professor. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the University of Rhode Island for what I know will be a thought-provoking conversation with our two guests. I'm going to make some remarks of thanks and context, and then introduce one of our guests, and then hand over to my colleague, who will tell you about the Metcalf Institute, and then introduce our second guest. Many people and units across the university have been generous with their funds and support to make this event possible. And technology comes to my... There we go. The Metcalf Institute and I are grateful to President Mark Parlange and the Office of the President, Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs Barbara Wolfe, Dean Jen Riley of the College of Arts and Sciences, recently retired Dean John Kirby, and Interim Dean Becky Sartini of the College of Environment and Life Sciences, the Office of External Relations and Communications, directed by Vice President Matthew MacDonald, the Center for the Humanities, directed by Dr. Evelyn Stern, the Department of English, chaired by Dr. Carolyn Batensky, the Harrington School of Communication and Media, directed by Associate Dean Thomas Stubblefield, the Department of Journalism and Public Relations, chaired by Dr. Dan Hunt, the Beta Chapter of Rhode Island of the Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society, Dr. Cheryl Foster, President, and Mrs. Charlotte Metcalf, a longtime supporter of the Metcalf Institute. For media logistics and administrative support, we are also grateful to Mel Thibault, Aaron Edmonds, Jeffrey Barbieri, Diwa Putra, Caitlin Cotter, Kristen Curry, and the URI Catering Services. Please join me in thanking our colleagues for their support. Tuesday, April 22nd was Earth Day. Yesterday, Wednesday, April 23rd, was the day generally reckoned to be the birthday of William Shakespeare, as well as the day he died. This coincidence is especially applicable to the expertise Genevieve Guenther brings to her work as a climate activist and public intellectual. In his madness on the heath, Lear gives full vent to a reign that is everything ignorant, lazy, selfish, and cruel. His narcissism having been denied its desire for complete obedience and indulgence, he calls down environmental disaster on his kingdom and its peoples. Blow, winds, and crack your cheeks, rage, blow, you cataracts and hurricanos. Spout till you have drenched our steeples, drowned our cocks. A little later, when confronted with the picture of true wretchedness, Lear has a change of heart. Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness, defend you from seasons such as these? Oh, I have taken too little care of this. Between and amongst the ruinous irresponsibility and insufficient regret, Lear and his fellows have a lot to say in justification of what has happened and what the consequences will be. Shakespeare's world came up with its explanations as we come up with ours. The world systems may be different. We have modern science and late capital. They had state religion and classical ethics. But the strategies are largely the same. That shallow pieties and rank hypocrisies circulate so easily alongside careful science and responsible reportage is due to propaganda, the dark side of rhetoric. Dr. Guenther honed her knowledge of rhetoric, its uses and abuses, while acquiring a doctoral degree in English with a specialty in Shakespeare and Renaissance studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and subsequently as a professional academic. Seeking a different life path, she trained herself in climate discourse and has become one of the most prominent voices in the climate debate as a writer, consultant, podcaster, and authority interviewed and cited in the most prominent media venues. She is the founding editor of End Climate Silence, an organization dedicated to encouraging, training, and cajoling the news media into reporting on the climate crisis in every story about climate, weather, agriculture, migration, natural disasters, in short, just about any story about human activity, as befits the anthropogenic origin of the climate crisis. We are excited she is with us today to talk about her recently published book, The Language of Climate Politics, Fossil Fuel Propaganda, and How to Fight It. Due to a slight indisposition, Dr. Guenther will be joining us remotely. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Genevieve Guenther. Genevieve, you might be muted. All right. Let's see. While we're fixing this, I will say, before I hand over, please silence your electronic devices if you have not done so already. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Farah Warner, the Executive Director of the Metcalf Institute, to tell you about the Institute and introduce our other guest, Farah.
Okay. Hi, thank you, Travis, and thank you to all of our guests here. If you don't know the Metcalf Institute, we have been here at the University of Rhode Island for 27 years. We were founded and came out of support for the publisher of the Providence Journal, Michael Metcalf, who passed away in 1999. Since then, the Metcalf Institute has grown considerably over the years, and our mission is to advance the public's understanding of climate and environmental science and to hopefully catalyze communities to take action. We do that through trainings and support and seminars and workshops and lectures like this, where we work with journalists, scientists, and science communicators to do this work of advancing the public's understanding of science-supported reporting and science-supported communication around climate and environmental issues that we're facing today. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Daniel Wolfe, who will be in conversation with Genevieve. Daniel was a 2024 alumnus of the Metcalf Annual Science Immersion Workshop, which is our longest running workshop, where we bring 10 journalists to the university every year in June. We put them through their paces. Some people call it summer camp for science journalists. They do science immersions. They go out into the field. They are found in salt marshes and in oyster beds, doing the work of science, and they spend a lot of time as well with URI scientists as well as others around southern New England to really understand how to translate science to their communities. Daniel is now the Climate Lab co-columnist at the Washington Post, a role he just recently moved into after working as a member of the Post graphics team since 2022. Throughout his tenure at the Post, Daniel is often focused on environmental and health impact of news events. He uses graphics and data visualization in coordination with his reporting to tell compelling stories for readers, including an amazing piece on how wildfires can introduce carcinogens into drinking water. He did an enormously important piece on how waterborne diseases are a risk for people in Gaza, and then also the mysterious die-offs of gray whales along the Pacific coast. Prior to joining the Post, he was the data and graphics editor for CNN's national news desk. So I welcome Daniel to the podium. And first, I'd love to make sure that we can hear Genevieve. Genevieve, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Daniel, if you'd like to come up and have a conversation. And please welcome everybody. Thank you.
Why, hello, Genevieve.
Hello, Daniel.
It's
even remotely.
It's nice to see you as well. Can everyone hear her from the laptop? Is she coming up? Okay. What background did you choose to?
Oh, it's a Chinese silk that I downloaded from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's website, which offered many backgrounds from their collections at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I like this one because it has a kind of environmental vibe to it, I think. And it's very forgiving. You can sort of see
my pillow that I'm leaning against disappearing and appearing again, but it's sort of like the background. So I'm hoping that it'll just seem of a piece.
Yeah, it's certainly a lot better than the hotel accommodations, and it's a nice natural setting for you. It looks great. You look great. Thank you so much. I have to just say you are such a champion being here and joining us on Zoom. If we had swapped places and I was sick, I would be already on my way back to New York. So everyone, if you could please give a huge hearty thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I really apologize for not being able to be there in person. I was looking so much forward to meeting all of you in person and having face-to-face conversations, but I must have eaten something bad yesterday. Who knows? But here I am, and at least we can talk about the book, the climate, media, all of the things that we were here to discuss from the beginning.
Yeah. Thank you so much for writing this work as well. I know I've gushed already to you. There were many moments when I was going through it where, as a journalist, I was just inspired with how it could inform me. As a father, it inspired me in how I can talk to and reach and make a better world for my kids. And just as a citizen, it really encouraged me that there are people like you uncovering the language of climate change political language and created this blueprint for us to look at and examine. So thank you so much for writing us. I find the layout or the way you organize the book particularly interesting. The chapters in this book are all keywords from, say, like a believable take you might hear from someone you run into at a coffee shop, or a political pundit you hear on the news, or maybe a family member over a holiday gathering. Do you have that part in front of you? Do you mind reading it to us?
Not at all. I have it in front of me. And just by way of a little context, what the book tries to do is examine the kind of belief system, the rhetoric that justifies maintaining the status quo, even as we build out clean energy, continuing to expand coal, oil, and gas extraction. That status quo, I argue in the book, is not justified by outright climate denial, but by this kind of soft climate denial, which acknowledges that climate change is real, but at the same time essentially says, it's fine, we can just keep using fossil fuels and deal with the problem anyway. And so that belief, I argue, is created by this, this little story that, as Daniel said, you would hear from perhaps a relative over Thanksgiving dinner or a policymaker, but which, the ultimate point is actually a form of fossil fuel propaganda that is based on falsehoods and maintains a kind of false complex of belief in our culture and in our politics. Okay, so this is how it goes. Yes, climate change is real, but calling it an existential threat is just, quote, alarmist. And anyway, phasing out coal, oil, and gas would, quote, cost us too much. Human flourishing relies on the economic, quote, growth enabled by fossil fuels. So we need to keep using them and deal with climate change by fostering technological, quote, innovation and increasing our, quote, resilience. Besides, America should not act unilaterally on the climate crisis while emissions are rising in, quote, India and China. So, as Daniel suggested, each chapter of the book takes one of those words and analyzes it deeply, tells the story of how it circulates through the culture, not only on the right, but also on the left, why it's wrong, and then above all, tells you how you can speak about these issues deeply and differently so as to raise voter support for actually phasing out fossil fuels.
Yeah, and I imagine maybe as you're hearing this that my experience in hearing it was it wasn't, oh, check. Yeah, that's wrong. Yeah, alarmist. Who says that? Growth, India and China, etc. But I found myself feeling complicit, feeling like, oh well, wait, how is innovation? How are we not going to innovate our way out of climate change? And it's something that's very special about your book. Very early on, is that you set the tone that we are investigating language, as the title suggests, and it put me on my toes, and it's very, very exciting in that way. How did you land on these concepts, or how did these? You must have like kept hearing these in the news, or yeah, in among your peers.
Yeah, I mean, when I first conceived of this project, I imagined doing a book with short entries about, over 23 to 25 words. It really was going to try to be a whole constellation of climate change discourse. And what I would do is, print out academic papers or print out newspaper or magazine articles or save tweets or um, save press releases from the White House. And I was just sort of compiling material at first. And I started to realize that the folders, I'm very old school, I was still using paper, that the folders for the words that I ended up writing about were significantly thicker than the folders for the other words I had been interested in. And I felt that these words really are what dominate the language of climate politics. And so in discussion with my literary agent, I decided to refashion the book and focus down on these words. Because even if you don't necessarily hear the word alarmist, say, sometimes you'll hear the word catastrophist, or you'll hear the word socialist, or you'll hear the word hysterical. You'll hear other words, but they connect back to these core terms, which really do thread throughout everything you're going to read about climate change, not only in the news media, but also in sort of academic and policy-making texts.
Yeah. I particularly like that you start with alarmist. It sets the tone. It is, pun intended, like the gaslighting of anyone who might have a discussion about climate change or reducing emissions. It is, as you identify, it's a popular tactic by the fossil fuel lobby or climate change deniers to sort of call scientists or any engaged citizen as essentially like a Chicken Little, that they're catastrophizing the situation. What makes it what makes that the sort of like core argument or the way to belittle or turn the conversation and put people on the back foot?
Yeah, that's a great question, because what I discovered as I was researching these terms is that they don't only come from sort of climate deniers on the right. They're not explicitly disinformation. They have a kind of life in the discourse of people on our side. So sometimes those people are absolutely bad actors. So, for example, there are climate change analysts like this Danish writer Bjorn Lomborg, for example, who has a whole career writing in the Wall Street, who is supposedly a climate change analyst, a risk analyst, but he has a whole career writing in the Wall Street Journal and places like USA Today, arguing that anyone who says that climate change needs to be dangerous, or climate change, what, well, that's a Freudian slip, or that anyone who says climate change is dangerous is essentially an alarmist and doesn't realize that if we continue to expand economic growth, we'll all be rich enough to shield ourselves from climate impacts. So that's someone who's sort of ambiguously in the climate space. There is a NGO in California called the Breakthrough Institute, who also, like Bjorn Lomborg, argues that we need a ton of innovation in order to solve climate change, but we should not actually even try to phase out fossil fuels because developing the global south through fossil fuels is the best way to bring people out of poverty. And we know this is not true because the economic analysis of what's going to happen to the global economy in the next decades if we don't halt global heating shows that this is exactly the way to make people not only poorer, but permanently so, to make it impossible to develop these parts of the planet because they will be essentially uninhabitable. So those are two people sort of in the climate space. But then the third group of people, very much in the climate space, who tend to sort of resonate with this accusation of alarmism more than you would think, are actually climate scientists. Not all of them, but many of them, in part because, as we know, scientists kind of construct their cultural authority by being unemotional, by doing research that is unbiased and objective, and that doesn't have any sort of hint of exaggeration or metaphor in it. It's a very sort of, this discourse of science is very data driven. It's very ideally black and white. And insofar as there is some ambiguity in what they're discovering, they talk about the sort of broad uncertainties of this. And they don't want to say anything also that might lead them to be accused of being alarmists or being manipulative, because of course, this has been a technique that climate deniers have used to try to delegitimize climate communicators and climate scientists. So very often you'll get climate scientists sort of scolding activists, and not just activists, like Antonio Guterres, for example, the head of the UN, once said that the era of global boiling has arrived. And oh, so many scientists were just up in arms about this, this metaphor, this hyperbole that he used, because he felt like that would expose them to ridicule. And then in addition, they worry about scaring people with their discourse because they don't want people to feel overwhelmed and disempowered. But the point is, it's not just a piece of disinformation that's kind of being lobbed from one direction and can be easily parried or dismissed for that reason. This is a whole complex of the way that people with tremendous amount of authority talk about the climate crisis, and prevent people from realizing actually that this is an emergency and we really do have to phase out fossil fuels essentially right now, and that later is too late. So it's that kind of dynamic where it's not just the right, it's also the left and the center, all sort of representing climate change and the language of climate change in analogous ways. That is what makes this the kind of common sense take and the status quo position. But again, as I sort of try to carefully show, it's actually a form of fossil fuel propaganda.
Yeah, it sort of embarrasses the person that they should be so smug to think that the end is near, or that things might get worse, or that if things get worse, there are no upsides to it, as you also talk about in your book. But I like, I mean, this is definitely your Renaissance scholar background speaking, but you do an excellent job of taking ownership of the language too, when possible. So could you remind us what the sort of root or etymology of alarmist is, and how we can rebrand ourselves that we aren't running scared?
Of course. So what I say in the end of this chapter is, I mean, one of the things I say in the chapter is that there was a whole sort of discourse that emerged through the news media in, I would say, 2021 and 2022, right around the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which started saying that we have averted the worst case scenario of climate change and that things are looking up, essentially, and that people in the United States could be reassured that there would only be so much warming, that we would basically be able to live as we do now, but not, in fact, have to worry about many people dying or economic devastation or starvation or any of those things. What I try to show patiently in this last section of the book is that, in fact, even though perhaps we are expecting less warming in the coming decades than we had a few years ago, the impacts of that warming are actually emerging, unfortunately, on the worst side of the range of possible outcomes. So there are, kinds of extreme weather events at less than 1.5 degrees Celsius of heating, which actually science hadn't anticipated seeing until over 2 degrees Celsius of heating. So even if we have less heating, we have no surety that it's not going to be bad for people in the United States and our children. And then I acknowledge that this is quite frightening. It is frightening. And so, there's a psychological defense mechanism where if something's frightening, you say, "Oh, that's just because they're trying to scare me. It's not really scary." No, it is scary. And so I exhort readers at the end of this chapter to have courage. Like we are being asked to be courageous at this moment in history in a way that I think none of us really wanted. Certainly, I didn't want to be thinking about climate change, really. I wanted to be thinking about Shakespeare. But it is frightening, and we need to have courage. At the same time, we can't get obsessed with a sort of natural science of climate change or the physics or the list of impacts that might come down the pike. What we need to do is sort of turn our attention away from that stuff which we can't control and focus on the people who are blocking the transformation that we need to make in order to halt global heating and preserve a livable future. And I encourage actually people in the book to cultivate a kind of moral indignation, a kind of outrage, a kind of anger against those people, and devote yourself to whatever degree is possible or palpable for you to fighting them. And so, just finally, to answer Daniel's question, the word alarm comes from the Italian alame, which is two arms, two arms. So this sense of alarm is actually something that should call us to take up arms against the people who are happy to destroy our children's future just for a few years more of profit, which they don't even need.
Speaking of people who are interested in destroying our children's future, I thought it'd be important to sort of talk about the sort of elephant in the room, our current political climate that we are living through. Your book, at times reading your book was really, in a perverse way, made me smile because I think a lot of the events are happening during the Republican primary, and so you have quotes from Vivek Ramaswamy, and you were talking about the sort of nuance of climate change conversations between political opponents, right? But we have a president now who's just saying the quiet part out loud, right? He's cleared the way for more coal and oil burning in his first week of office, as we learned this week, is trying to open up national monuments for mining and gas and oil extraction. He has targeted NIH funding, which hits very at home here in URI, but also across the country. The EPA is being defunded with roles eliminated and regulations rolled back. So what does this current political moment mean to us in terms of how we talk about these issues now?
Well, I mean, ironically, the first sentence of my book quotes Donald Trump saying that climate change is a hoax. And then I immediately go on to say that kind of outright climate denial isn't really sort of powerful in our current politics anymore. Now it's this sort of other softer denial where you acknowledge the problem is real. Of course, Trump is, very much at the center of our politics now, and he continues to insist that climate change is a hoax. His Secretary of Energy, though, Chris Wright, is a very extreme form of lukewarmer, the kind of person who acknowledges climate change is real, but doesn't think it's going to be that bad. He's been quoted recently as saying, oh, actually, there are going to be benefits to global heating, like that kind of argument. I mean, Trump has not only sort of opened up new oil and gas patches for drilling, he's also essentially um, destroyed US government capacity to fight climate change by firing people at agencies, by threatening to go after state governments and AGs that try to pass legislation at the state level. He's forbid scientists from joining the climate IPCC meetings leading up to the next assessment report. He is trying through the EPA to reverse the endangerment finding, which was a finding that uh, acknowledged that carbon dioxide in excess is actually a pollutant and endangering Americans. And so that's what gives the government the statutory authority to try to regulate it. And they're trying to overturn that. So it's just they're trying to completely um, decimate any possibility of the United States uh, dealing with climate change. And they're also wiping the words climate change out of all government documents. They are not renewing NASA's lease at Columbia University. I mean, it's just totally across the board. The Pentagon is, however, still investing in resilience for its coastal bases, but other than that, it's I mean, it's beyond anything that you would imagine. But that's what you can say about everything that Donald Trump is doing and the Republicans are helping him do in the government, right? They're trying to effect an authoritarian takeover that, you know, on the global scene, allies them with Russia and Saudi Arabia and other petrostates that are not democracies. Um, and so at this point, I think that we need to pivot a little bit. And if climate is the thing that makes you care, that makes you feel outraged, that gives you courage, then think about climate. But the thing that we need to do is get these people out of power. We need to depose them, essentially, or else we're not going to have a chance to rebuild what they've destroyed and to actually do what is necessary to halt global heating. Ironically, and this is what I say in my India and China chapter, China has positioned itself to be the climate leader of the 21st century, not only absolutely cornering the market on clean energy technologies already, but also passing the most comprehensive climate legislation of any nation in the world. And still, just Xi yesterday, I think, increased the stringency of China's climate targets according to the Paris Agreement timetable and, you know, reconfirmed his commitment to decarbonizing China and leading the world into a different future. And China and Europe are also having a meeting about the climate goals of the Paris Agreement, to which the United States wasn't even invited. That said, it seems hard to imagine that we're going to hit net zero emissions without the United States. So again, the thing that we have to do now is do whatever we need to do to get these people out of power.
Uh, I want to touch on China in a little bit as well. There's just like so many. I'm caught thinking, well, where should we go from here? I do also want to touch on the sort of the techno optimist, the billionaire class that has also cozied up with President Trump in this administration. And you color them in the sort of innovation focused chapter where we're talking about this sort of bias in an economic model where this idea that there's no such thing as scarcity, that growth can always happen, that land is not finite, but that as long as you pursue technological advancements, that you can always tech your way out of a problem, and it finds no sort of it's no better mascot than sort of Elon Musk, who sort of has his own perspectives that the Earth could burn up, but we could send everyone to Mars and colonize Mars to fix our own problems. Do you mind talking about sort of the issues around this obsession with innovation or technology being the solution, that we don't have to cut out fossil fuels from our lives.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with innovation. I mean, for many years after, so the big seminal event, I think, in climate politics of the past 20 years was the publication of the special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius that the IPCC released in 2018. It was the first time that people realized that even 2 degrees Celsius wasn't a safe temperature, and that the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius of heating over pre-industrial temperatures meant, significant damage and was something that we would really want to avoid. Furthermore, it also said that we would have to halve our emissions globally by 2030 and zero them out to net zero by 2050 if we were even going to have a 50-50 chance of halting global heating at 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that was a total shock and a real wake-up call. And coming in, in tandem with the rise of Greta Thunberg and a whole youth climate movement, various other events, um, this created a sense that if you were going to be serious on the public scene, you needed to think about climate change. And so Elon Musk and, oh God, what is his name? The Microsoft founder, Bill
Really,
Gates,
yes.
um, because they don't want their lifestyles curtailed in any way, and because they are capitalists who believe uh, in this myth that there is never scarcity and that we can just simply innovate our way out of any problem. Um, Started talking about climate innovation as the thing that was going to save the planet. But in their discourse at that time, innovation didn't just sort of mean new technologies, new forms of production and consumption, new ways of living, new creations. It was actually a code for carbon dioxide removal. So both Musk and Gates put up $100 million for prizes to try to discover the most efficacious forms of carbon removal because they said that if we got this technology going, then we could keep using fossil fuels and simply like deal with their side effects, deal with their externalities by pulling the carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere. So this was kind of the dominant way that, green capital, as it were, saw the problem for those years as something that could be fixed with this kind of technology. And indeed, governments were, then Biden's government was really, really into this because it would really help the political problem of how you actually phase out fossil fuels. Um, because of course that does involve stranded assets. And there are investments that need to be made up front. Not everybody can afford to buy an EV out of pocket, for example. So innovation, carbon dioxide removal in that case, was touted as the sort of magic silver bullet that would solve the problem. Just this past week, the winner of Musk's X Prize was announced, and it was a form of carbon dioxide removal that can't possibly, it was enhanced rock weathering that can't possibly remove our current emissions, let alone reverse the sort of damage that we've done before and bring our carbon dioxide, atmospheric carbon dioxide back down to a safer level. And of course, a few months ago, Bill Gates announced that he was disbanding his climate group, Breakthrough Energy, and no longer lobbying the government for climate solutions or funding any NGOs that researched climate innovation, because they were doing this as I argue in the book. I knew this was going to happen because they were doing it as a form of greenwashing. Because if you actually read the science of carbon dioxide removal, you would know that it's very challenging to reverse entropy. It's very challenging to take a dispersed molecule out of the air. It takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of material, and we're going to need it in order to offset emissions from agriculture, um, buildings, potentially. So we will need it, but it's not something that's ever going to be able to allow us to continue to emit 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year and just have that offset by carbon dioxide removal. And they probably knew it too, but they were willing to do these PR stunts because it really was a phase of uh, human history where you could have lost your social license to operate if you had the kind of like outright climate denial that Trump then normalized again and made sort of, the dominant form in United States politics.
Right.
So,
If you don't have your side pony greenwashing project, you're under the scrutiny of the media. But if you have a $600 million project that's removing millions of tons of carbon dioxide, which all sounds really great on paper, you might get a news story in the Washington Post, as you point out. But it amounts to removing 15 minutes worth of emissions globally amid all of that cost, as you point out.
exactly.
Yeah, so often the book returns to the question of emissions and how that comes back into it. You point to previous presidential administrations that they never, while they took place in Kyoto Protocol or these global summits, that they never entered into legally binding agreements into reducing emissions. And one part that had me chuckle was you pointed out an essay from Michael Pollan that perpetuates this sort of literally why bother um, message. You mind reminding me what he says there? I think I
Yeah, let me look at the text. Just a second.
it's sort of like why even
I have it.
try? Okay.
Yeah, so the one time that Michael Pollan, whose writing I generally love, just let me note that.
Yeah, I mean I should say I chuckled at it because he's a beloved essayist, and no one escapes your microscopic vision of their language. So that's why I laughed.
Well, I will say that writing the India and China chapter was the most challenging part of this. Um, not only because I didn't know the first thing about Chinese climate politics or the way that, China's politics works in general. So that was a huge, heavy lift of research that I needed to do. But also because I also was someone who thought, well, darn, like, here I am trying to move domestic policy, and China's just their emissions are going up and up and up and up. So I, I do indict Pollan for this attitude, but I will confess freely here that I had it too, right? Because what do we know? You look at the chart and their emissions are going up, and it seems really scary. And you only hear that they're bad actors in international climate agreements from politicians that you trust, like the Biden administration or the Obama administration. That was perhaps the most devastating part of writing this book, realizing that, Obama was not a climate champion. But let me go back to Pollan. So Michael Pollan asks in his one essay on climate entitled, Why Bother? What the point would be of his doing anything about climate change when he knows, quote, full well that, as he says, quote, halfway around the world, there lives my evil twin, some carbon footprint doppelganger in Shanghai or Chongqing, who's positively itching to replace every last pound of CO2 I'm struggling no longer to emit. It's striking that even such an observant writer as Pollan gets the villain so wrong. Not governments supporting fossil energy with their policies, nor fossil fuel companies fighting the transition to a safe energy system, but a Chinese evil twin who's positively itching to emit carbon dioxide. And this evil twin is, of course, a vaguely racist caricature that hides the real bad actors, which are governments. Well, they're the fossil fuel companies and the governments that are supporting them.
Yeah, it's a tempting myth, and I too felt that way too, reading that exemplary sentence that you tee off at the beginning of the book, and I found myself, yeah, learning a lot in that passage, and you return to this time and again in the book um, that it's economically in our best interest to reach net zero, and you say that study after study shows that net zero is affordable, and we are seeing it, and we should see peer countries like China as moving towards that and actually making smart political moves in
Right.
cornering the market on renewable energy. Could you talk more about why it's fiscally responsible to reach net zero?
Well, there are there are two ways to talk about the economic dimension of reaching net zero. One is a sort of cost benefit analysis that compares the cost of reaching net zero to the cost of not doing anything. And on that level, there is absolutely no comparison whatsoever. The reason that climate action has seemed unaffordable is that a right-wing economist named William Nordhaus, who also coincidentally was the father of climate economics, created a cost benefit model that downplayed the economic impacts of climate change to such an extent that he argued it was actually optimal on a cost benefit uh, ratio to allow the planet to heat up to 3 degrees Celsius. But as I was writing this book, there was already a lot of economic analysis that would bring in impacts that Nordhaus um, left out for no reason except his own choice that already showed that, in fact, halting global heating at 1.5 degrees Celsius is a benefit. It is less costly than letting the planet heat up to even 2 degrees Celsius. And since the book has come out, there has been one study after another that has gotten so much better at bringing in all the different kinds of impacts, not just heat or drought or flood, but, human health, um, socio-political instability, inflation due to rising food prices, et cetera, et cetera. And just in January, the UK Institute of Actuaries, and this is like a Victorian era British institution. These people are not hippies. They're British mathematicians that work with the insurance industry, released a study that said that at 3 degrees Celsius, which is our current emissions trajectory, and the thing that Nordhaus said was optimal, at 3 degrees Celsius, worst case, the global economy will contract 50% by half sometime between 2070 and 2090. And this would not be like a contraction like the Great Depression, which we could come out of again. This would be a permanent impoverishment of everybody. And that's just like the most shocking study because it comes from such, I think, a reliable institution. So even just on the terms of like comparing the cost of action to the cost of doing nothing, creating net zero is absolutely a benefit. The second level is, can we afford the upfront costs of phasing out fossil fuels and transforming our energy system, our built environment, doing the innovation we need to do in order to have industry run on zero carbon, not just carbon dioxide removal, et cetera, et cetera? And the answer by all accounts is yes. So Noval Harari has this wonderful TikTok, just to pull something out of my head, where he talks about the fact that it would cost 3 to 4% of GDP to make this entire transformation. And that's really not that much money if you are thinking about the difference between a livable and an unlivable future. It's not 10%, it's not 20%, it's certainly not 60%, it's 4%. And Princeton's Net Zero Lab also in 2019 did a study that came up with basically the same number for decarbonizing the United States. So it's imminently affordable. I mean, the amount of money that trillionaires made during the pandemic alone would get us a long way down the path to net zero. And then finally, there's also the point that decarbonizing our economies would make quite literally 90% of the people on this planet better off, and most Americans better off, because clean energy, solar and wind, is free. And yes, you need to pair them with batteries, but once the system is in place, our electricity bills will go down, our heating bills will go down, our transportation bills will go down, our healthcare costs will go down. The amount of money we spend on healthcare to offset the effects or attempt to offset the effects of fossil fuel burning and air pollution would curl your hair. Drew Schindel, an economist at Duke University, argued that even if the United States decarbonized unilaterally, the healthcare savings would pay for decarbonization with billions of dollars left over. So it's affordable, it's doable, it's an economic benefit on the macro scale, and for people who would be really served by having their real incomes raised. The problem is that it would also involve trillions of dollars of stranded assets. And it would involve a kind of small banking crisis because, of course, the banks have been financing fossil fuel development, expecting to get a return on those investments, right, over the next decades. So there would be a contraction in this sector. It would need that stranded asset problem would need to be managed so as not to percolate through the whole economy. And rich people would need to take a little bit of hit in their portfolios. So people who are in fossil fuel equities would need to understand that they weren't going to continue to see a profit on those equities, that they would be taken out of the portfolio. I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel very strongly that rich people in the United States and across the globe can well afford to take that hit in order to preserve the only planet that we know supports life in the universe. So, but of course, the people with the most cultural, the most political, the most ideological power in the world are the very people who would be faced with those stranded assets, and governments and dealing with that problem is not something that can be really done by markets. And so it would require a new form of governing, real explicit conversation of what kind of economy we want to build. And that's that is a political challenge for every government, because all of us are subject to the ideology that, says as long as capitalism works and the economy keeps growing, people will do better, our kids will do better, we'll all be happier. And so absorbing that that's a myth is challenging. And then even once you absorb that that's a myth, sort of thinking about how we do this in a way that's fair, that's equitable, that is speedy, is, perhaps in some ways one of the greatest governance challenges of human civilization ever. But I believe that we can do it. Certainly we can do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we're going to move to, I'm getting the signal to move towards questions in a little bit. I wanted to encourage the room to take like a deep breath with me, because we've been talking about really heady topics, and maybe your like neuroses are coming out, you're picking at your nails or grinding your teeth. So let's do a big in and out. Genevieve, are we doomed? I joke, of course. In your final or in your final chapter on resilience, you remind us that protest works, and you arm us and energize us with sort of a three-part message to raise the alarms and to be active citizens, and to sort of regain this political process. Do you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. So this book, let me just say two things. First of all, again, in the same way that I recommended in the beginning not to look at the science of climate change too carefully, or think about the impacts too deeply, because you're essentially forcing yourself to engage with something you can't control. I actually recommend that you don't even really engage with the sort of effects of your political activism or with larger kind of macro questions. I suggest that you turn inward and ask yourself what kind of person you want to be. And in this moment in history, how do you want to be remembered by your children, by your children's children? What is your value of to life on this planet? So that, I think, is a much healthier and more effective way to sort of stay in this fight, because you can't, no one person can sort of take on the whole. You can only control yourself. Okay, so that's the first thing. And then the second thing is this book was not written to teach you how to talk to climate deniers or to climate skeptics or to, argue with your cranky uncle over a barbecue in your backyard or whatever. This book was written to teach you how to talk to people who were already concerned or alarmed about the climate crisis, but still believed that we can keep using fossil fuels and still halt global heating anyway, or still deal with climate change in some way anyway. And I did actually do focus group polling after the book was done, after it had actually gone to my editor. So thank God it has turned out the way that it did. And it turns out that the messages that I give you in the book do raise support for phasing out fossil fuels among concerned and alarmed Democrats and Republicans by up to 10 points. And so that's a huge
Amazing
jump. And that can get us to majorities, which we're not in right now. So the messages work. And in terms of your sort of emotional relationship with the people that you're speaking to, your job is to, raise their alarm, let them look at the reality, then turn their attention to the bad actors who are preventing us from solving this, even though we totally can solve it, and encouraging them to feel a kind of moral indignation against the evil of those people. And then also give people a vision of the world as it could be that they can desire. So fear, anger, and desire. You need all three of those things in order to really, be roused into action. So that's what I hope the book equips you to do. And, I think that people haven't changed. These people, Democrats who are concerned and alarmed about climate change, have not changed just because Trump has been elected. And so I do think that these messages are still relevant and still useful. And, again, the job here is to get the Trump regime out of power so that we can start over and start rebuilding as soon as humanly possible. And so I encourage you all to, not just protect, but also try to fight, because that's what's needed right now.
Here, here. Thank you so much.
And again, I'm sorry I wasn't with you in person. But Daniel, it was great to talk to you.
Yeah,
Anyway.
it was lovely. It feels COVID era chic speaking to you this way. Yeah, we're going to open it up to questions. I believe there's a microphone. Genevieve, if you can't hear the question in the room, I'm happy to repeat it. So if you have questions, I don't know if it makes better sense for us to come to you or for you to line up.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, first of all, Genevieve, thank you for a really awesome discussion, and thank you, Danielle. I really appreciate it. I really hope it wasn't my fault that you were feeling under the weather. So I sat next to you for a little while, last night. But anyway, one thing that one thing that I had worked on a couple of years ago with students was on looking at agrovoltaics. So in 200 years, we will still have this nuclear, fusion reactor in the sky and we will be able to, basically the simple economics is if you could cover 10% of the irrigated agriculture in the United States with solar cells, and there's lots of reasons, the plants don't need so many bands of radiation and so much radiation. You would use less water. You would keep the solar cells cool because of the evaporation of the water, so the efficiency of the solar cell. And if you did that, you would basically, and you were kind of talking about it. I remember we calculated what the United States spent on the war in Iraq. If we did that, we could actually basically, stop climate change in the United States, at least the U.S. Effect. So it was what's interesting is some of those students now are professors at universities around the U.S., and they're actually making progress, and it was being picked up all over the U.S., but also in China. There was a lot of back and forth in other countries, and I'm just wondering, obviously you finish with, we have to fight or we have to have the next election and so forth. But I think there's actually a lot of hope, and I haven't read your book yet. I did buy a copy, but I think one of the important things is there is real hope that one could actually turn this around. I get it, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, probably very, very difficult. And also the geoengineering argument. So those people have actually sort of moved on, and I won't mention which universities are investing in that now, but it's kind of dramatic. But I think your talk of hope for it being realistic technologically is a good message. So I'm not sure I have a question here, but I just want to say awesome talk, and I'm really looking forward to your book, and thank you. And I'm sorry I made you sick, so I feel guilty. So, but I would just say I'd be just interested in your thoughts for students, because you hit it at the end of your discussion with Daniel about wind and solar, and that being so important, because we, even here in the greeny area that we live, we see lots of signs of no wind and so forth, and just your thoughts about that. It's a bit the anti climate change issue as well, I would say.
Well, I mean, I think that the solutions are there, and they're available, and they're easier than anyone likes to acknowledge. So I tend to discourage people from finding hope in the technological solutions, because we have the solution. I mean, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, pointing out that the solutions existed felt wonderful because people were genuinely unsure of whether we could substitute clean for fossil energy. And now we know we can. But just in terms of climate communication, I tend to discourage people from finding hope in talking about the technological solutions, because the problem is the people blocking those solutions from being implemented. So, and in some ways, that's almost like a harder conversation to have, because our politics, especially right now, feel so broken. But I like to point to, Churchill feeling that England was just about to be invaded by the Nazis just before the United States entered World War II. I mean, if you read his letters from that period, he was filled with despair. And then look what happened. So I think it's important to cultivate our uncertainty, our understanding that we don't know what's going to happen, but that we're not going to get those technological solutions implemented, even though they're there and they're wonderful, if we don't transform our politics and put different people in power. I mean, so for example, the latest kind of, I see something, this is kind of a tangent, but I'm just going to mention it anyway. I see something emerging right now that's in the discourse around climate change of today, which is analogous to some of the dynamics I cover in the book, which is that liberals on the left are arguing that we need to deregulate energy so that we can permit energy quickly in order to implement those solutions, without actually acknowledging that the fossil fuel industry also wants deregulation in the energy space. And one thing that Doug Burgum is doing, for example, is he's just announced that new fossil energy projects are going to be permitted in 28 days, that they're deregulating so quickly. And Burgum is explicitly known as an abundance guy by some of the people on the left who are arguing for this kind of abundance, that if you get the government out of the way, then the markets can do what they do best. And so this is another way that I worry that leads to a sort of all of the above energy approach, which isn't going to get us to where we want to go. So again, it's those kinds of dynamics that I hope that people who talk about climate will focus on, instead of just the technology, because I think most people know that the technology is there. And if they don't, they need to learn. But I think the problem is, and it's certainly that's the problem with young people, that they don't see a way through our current political moment. And that's what we're sort of behooved to envision for them.
Genevieve, can you hear?
I can't hear at all. No, I'm sorry. Daniel, you can maybe just repeat or something.
Yeah, I think we're just checking on the microphone. We're gonna get our one that works.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay. I'm a pretty loud person, so I was surprised. But thank you so much for this talk. I am a PhD student here at URI, actually writing my dissertation about misinformation and disinformation on offshore wind. So I'm really inspired. I'm really inspired by your work, and there's a lot of insights that I'm going to take away from today. So thank you so much. I want to return to some of the comments you made about how scientists and the ways that they establish their cultural authority try to appear as unbiased. Can you talk more about how, as science communicators, how to balance the need to not overstate scientific findings while also still calling urgency to the issues and finding ways that we can move forward? Because, yeah, if you could speak more to that, that'd be great.
I mean, I recommend, it's funny, I'm giving a paper at the University of Essex in the UK exactly about this question, how scientists can think of themselves as citizen scientists, engaging with the public in a way that moves policy without actually undermining their authority as objective communicators or objective analysts. And one way that this has been done in the past is to argue that there is no such thing as objective science, that any piece of knowledge is situated in its quote, cultural and historical moment, and that very often science has reproduced the ends of power. And I find that that is not the right way to go about it, because that is something that has gotten very much appropriated by bad actors. I think we absolutely need to hold on to the concept of truth and objectivity and dispassion and all those things which, lead you to say 2 + 2 = 4 and not 2 + 2 = 5, to cite 1984. That said, when you're saying 2 + 2 = 5, I would encourage scientists, and I think this is what I'm going to say. I haven't thought it completely through, but I would encourage scientists to speak as human beings. Start with an I statement, 2 + 2 = 5, and I worry that 5 is dangerous. Because weirdly, if you actually look at scientific rhetoric, you will very often hear value judgments in sort of threaded through the supposedly dispassionate science communication, but they're introduced in a way that the philosophy of language calls as not at issue content. So like if you say, oh, Jack was really annoying at the party which he came to with his wife. Like that statement is about Jack being annoying at the party, but you've also introduced this fact that he has a wife, but not as what the conversation really is. And so I feel that there are very often kind of ideological assumptions that are sometimes not so helpful because very often climate scientists are actually techno-optimists um, introduced into the discourse in that way. So I would encourage everybody to try to be very, very, very conscious of, even if you are a techno-optimist, of your emotions and your opinions and your imaginations for the future, and then add that in specifically within that frame. Because I think, despite the fact that there has been a death of expertise in the United States, I think most people do actually trust scientists. And I think if a scientist says, I think that we'll be fine because the price of clean energy will keep dropping or whatever, that's clearly represented as an opinion. And so it's much safer than to say, well, we estimate this because the price of clean energy will continue to drop. Conversely, if someone says, five, I worry that five is dangerous, that is a really good way to sort of create a human connection with the people that are listening to you and get them a little bit to think about, um, you know, what this information means to them personally. So I think there needs to be sort of a new, I don't know, a new norm introduced, which is encouraging scientists to use the pronoun I and then think, feel, whatever. So I don't know if that's helpful yet, but that's sort of what I've been thinking through recently.
Sorry. Hi, sorry. I'm the next question. I don't know if you can see me or not. I am a journalism major. Hi, I'm a journalism major here at the university, and I spend a lot of time like talking to students and interviewing them. And I think that your characterization after President Prolonge's question of young people feeling a bit paralyzed is very, very accurate, even amongst students that study a lot of this work. I just was wondering if in writing this book, you ever felt those moments of like being paralyzed over everything that was happening, and kind of how you worked through them to continue to do this work.
Yeah, I mean, 100%, right? I mean, it's impossible not to. So one of the things that I learned one of the things that I learned that was very painful was that Obama was not a climate champion. Another thing that I learned was that many of the models for how the world could possibly reduce emissions to net zero include really just extraordinary amounts of carbon dioxide removal in them, um, giving bad actors this kind of legitimacy, even though those models are really just hypothetical. They're sort of, we could do it this way. And, technically, in theory, there's no reason we couldn't do it this way. There's a really good book that I am reviewing for the Los Angeles Review of Books called Overshoot, which is about those models and how those putatively hypothetical models actually helped to delay the needed phase out of fossil fuels after the Paris Agreement. But anyway, all of which is to say, when I learned about that and felt like there was a kind of weird complicity in the IPCC, I actually took to bed for a day. I was so depressed. Um, but again, like the way I keep going is that I have decided that this is what I want to do on this planet for myself, for me, so that at the end of the day, at the end of my life, I can look back and say, okay, I was one of the people that tried, and my life can stand as evidence that people aren't selfish entirely, people aren't entirely benighted, and that mother love is real and all those things. So I think that just kids need to be um, encouraged to think about these qualities that you don't really cultivate in our culture anymore, like duty and self-respect, and like, not because you're thin, but because you're doing something really challenging. for the good of others. Like all of those things, I feel like we can try to cultivate in young people. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who I quote in the book precisely on this problem, says she does it because she doesn't want them to feel like they get to win without her fighting back. Like she doesn't want them to have that satisfaction. So whatever your thing is, right? But it has to be a thing that's for you and not, determined by the outcomes of your actions, because that way just misery lies.
Hello.
Yes, I hear you.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm thrilled to take part in this wonderful discussion. My name is Leanne, and I am representing the English department. I am an English PhD student, as well as an instructor of record for the university. And I'm really interested in perhaps the opportunity to have you clarify the impact of artificial intelligence on our environment, with the alleged claims that artificial intelligence, has a negative impact on our environment. And, AI is something I think about all the time in my work. And I'm really interested to hear if you could speak more on that topic. Thank you.
Yeah. So,
I just wanted to say in my
yeah.
in my notes, I asked AI to stand up for itself and to answer if AI is going to end climate change. Before you respond, do you want to hear what AI has to say?
Sure, let's hear it.
It said, AI won't single-handedly end climate change, but I can definitely play a major role in slowing it down, adapting to it, and even helping us reverse some damage if paired with strong policies, innovation, keyword, and human action. So, sorry, I just saw a great opportunity to bring in that chat quote.
I mean, not to put a too fine point on it, but that seems like bullshit to me.
Yes, it seems it could be a whole another book of keywords, or at least it's imitating a lot of the words and language that you identify.
Yeah. I mean, well, this is the problem with AI, at least as it exists now. It's simply imitating the internet, right? It's recombining the internet in new ways. So you're usually going to get the kind of status quo understanding of something through AI asking it. Again, it might change, but that's what I get the sense now. In any event, the problem, there are two problems with AI. The first is its hunger for energy and water. Uh, that's a real problem because even though, we do have the solutions to climate change in solar and wind, and we have abundant land and everything that we need, it is also the case that it will be easier if energy demand drops a bit instead of rises as it's doing now due to AI. The second problem is a political problem, which is that the people who are developing AI are the Silicon Valley fascists who are collaborating with the Trump administration, and they are perfectly happy to power their technology using fossil fuels and even coal, for example. So, and Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, said something that is just if it's just I don't even know how, it's gobsmacking. He said, yes, AI is going to make climate change worse, but one day it will also solve the problem for us. So we should just double down on fossil fuels to like really get it where it needs to go. There's no machine that's going to solve the political problems that we're facing. So, and also part of the drive to AI is a desperate hope that this will, increase productivity. And at least in my view, it's a hope that it'll increase productivity, undermine the power of labor, create a new sort of round of profits and economic growth. And it's certainly, and the social benefits that a lot of these technologists are talking about really just stand in my ear as the kind of most vulgar ideological obfuscation that they don't really care about the social benefits. They care about productivity and weakening labor and profit. So I'm not a big fan of AI. I've tried to use it twice, and each time I thought it was like I asked it. I had a very long article on China that was like, almost 9,000 words, and I asked it to bring it down to an 800-word piece in the style of The Atlantic, and it got the style of The Atlantic right, and none of my arguments showed up in the piece.
Wow.
Granted, a human being might not be able to like that size of an article down into an 800-word piece, but AI couldn't do it either. And then the second thing I asked I guess Chat GPT, I should say, um, can you tell me about climate change and how we can solve it? And again, it was just sort of like the status quo understanding of climate change that's out there on the internet. And I thought, okay, well, at least for now, this is not giving us anything that we need. And if anything, it's just making people stupider. So I'm happy. I'm I'm happy, and I am terrified of college students using Chat GPT to write because I firmly believe that you only learn anything by trying to write about it. So it's not just about a product, it's actually about the process. And the process of writing is precisely what enables you to recognize propaganda and think critically and do all the things you need to do to be a citizen in the democracy. So to me, it seems like a sort of proto-fascist or fascist even technology that's, emerging at this political moment, not coincidentally. But again, a lot of people I know quite love it. And my husband is a software engineer at Google and he's working on it. So other people that I care about greatly have a different idea about these technologies, but that's my take.
Right. We're going to take one more question, and I think it will go to this lady here. Hold on just.
Hi, thank you so much. So I actually was trained as a climate scientist, so I kind of, and I also teach. I actually teach artists because my goal is to communicate better with the rest of humanity because, as I point out, first of all, I have noticed that this upcoming generation is absolutely terrified of climate change. And as you point out, sort of rightly so, yes, but I also find that when you talk about scientists kind of try and downplay it, I don't want to play on the terror so much that they're paralyzed. That's not helpful in my experience, but also that that I agree with you towards the end when you talk about the optimism, but there's anything, we can do almost anything. What's missing is money and political will. But what I can't figure out exactly, and what I hope you might elaborate on is, all right, so if all it's missing is money and political will, and the money will come. If there's political will to do it, then the money will come afterwards. That's obvious. So political will is all that's missing. How do we make that happen? We've gone past the vote. Like everyone's like, yeah, vote. That didn't work out so well for us last time. And we talk about, protest. And I do firmly believe that protest is effective. It might be the only way. I do try to bring up, like you talked about Winston Churchill. I think about Gandhi, how it starts with one person, and he manages to throw off an empire, not by himself, obviously, but it starts with one person. But I'm missing that, and then do you have a recipe for this? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so the reason I wrote the book for these Democrats who are concerned and alarmed, but believe that we can keep using fossil fuels is that I actually don't think our politics has been that ineffective. I do think the surge of alarm after the 2018 SR 1.5 report was actually quite effective. But the problem is that people were asking for climate action, they were asking for new renewable energy development, and it's some combination of people not knowing, people don't know, and haven't sort of grappled with the reality of, no, actually, we have to phase out fossil fuels. So I think that the kinds of actions globally that we saw leading up to the pandemic are very effective. And it's not like we have to recreate the real. We just have to be asking for the right things. So my theory of change is not that we sort of like expand the tent or build political will for climate action in this kind of broad way, but we have a large but very motivated group of people who are specifically asking governments to do what's necessary to phase out fossil fuels, and asking in a way that's disruptive, repeatedly, not just one climate march, but a climate march every week, or strikes, or civil disobedience, whatever. So that to me is what we need to get to, but it relies on asking for the right thing.
Well, thank you so much, Genevieve. We all are wishing you a speedy recovery. Thank you so much for your time, your wisdom in writing this book. We do have it available here for people to pick up if they want to follow you. What is the best way to sort of keep in touch or keep track of your work?
Yeah, I mean, I have a website, genevieveguenther.com.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a .com, God help me. So, and there you can see what I like, my articles and events. There are links to my social media platforms at the bottom. But it's definitely the best place to connect. And you can send me an email through the contact page. So yeah, you can check out my website, and I hope we can all stay in touch. Thank you so much for inviting me to this beautiful campus. And Daniel, thank you for reading my book at all, but also so sensitive and closely and with such, generosity. And again, I'm really sorry that I had to spend the day in bed. But I didn't think it was possible, but I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, you made it great. Thank you.